Let's move away from our discussion of the world of business and get into the business of what's happening in the Middle East. Privileged to be joined by Justice Secretary, Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy, who joins me now. Much to discuss, but first off, if we can, Deputy Prime Minister, can you give us an update of the situation now and, of course, the involvement of both British military personnel and the safety of those Britons trying to get home? Morning to you, sir.
Well, let's start with the safety of those trying to get home, because you'll have many listeners who have friends, colleagues across the region very pleased that that flight arrived from Oman this morning, finally, but also that staff were able to thank FCDO ground staff on the ground. We've had 6,500 people leave UAE. We've got rapid deployment teams from the FCDO across the region, and we are working with airlines where airspace opens up to get more people out, particularly from the UAE, more charter flights from Oman in the coming hours and days. But it will be dependent on airspace opening up. It will be dependent on safety. Of course, that's essential, and getting people through routes also on road is an issue. This is a big evacuation, far bigger even than Afghanistan.
Of those 6,500 people you referenced, Deputy Prime Minister, how many were on the government-chartered aircraft?
I haven't got the numbers in front of me, Nick.
It's going to be a couple of hundred, isn't it? 300?
Well,
approximately.
My understanding...
And it was 24 hours late, Deputy Prime Minister, because the pilot hadn't had the necessary rest period. How was that allowed to happen?
Well, I think that delays in a febrile circumstances can happen, and then you can't have a pilot fly over a certain amount of hours. So
But why wasn't that worked out in advance, that he or she had the necessary break period, Deputy Prime Minister?
I think that that's what's happened. But, Nick, when I listened to those who had come off the plane, they were relieved, and they thanked staff, FCDO staff, for the support they put in on the ground, although I accept, of course, waiting in Oman airport would not have been a great experience.
But Mr. Lammy, they were waiting on the aircraft as well. There were reports of people banging on the window, utter confusion, because they didn't know why they could take off, and they would feel rather vulnerable, stuck on an aircraft in the fringes of a war zone, not being told what was happening. That's unacceptable.
I do recognise that, but there are aviation rules. It is a febrile situation, yes, of course, with missiles. I do think that, as stressful as it would have been, that people seem to recognise that when they landed in Stansted. We will do everything we can to get people out as swiftly and as carefully as possible.
How many more flights, government chartered flights, are there planned for today or through the weekend, Deputy Prime Minister?
The Foreign Secretary updated us yesterday. There are flights planned, but we're careful because, of course, airspace can shut at any time. So I don't want to say a number, but there are charter flights that we hope, more charter flights in the coming days, that will leave from Oman.
And you cannot give me an idea of a number you're working towards? 4, 5, 6 from here till Sunday night, or whatever it might be?
You recognise that I'm not a Foreign Office Minister, but I'm nervous.
Prime Minister, Mr. Lammy.
Nick, I'm nervous about giving numbers because, I say 2, and then airspace shuts down and flights don't leave, is the truth.
I think all my listeners would understand. Well, let's move to other matters, if we can, and the level of preparedness. There is considerable criticism of the Prime Minister in that it wasn't until Tuesday we actually decided to deploy HMS Dragon, some 72 hours after the conflict. Why the delay, Mr. Lammy?
I think the first thing to say is that there was rapid deployment pre-deployment into the region from January and February. That's why F-35s were in the region. That's why radar is in the region. We've got 400 personnel dealing with air defences across the region. HMS Dragon will be in the region in the coming weeks. That is not the only capability we have to protect air defences in Cyprus and across the Gulf.
But if you were deploying aircraft, military aircraft, why wasn't the ship readied?
Well, it's also the case that and I saw the Defence Secretary stressing this yesterday, you coordinate with allies. People may have forgotten that Cyprus is a NATO ally. That's why the French, the Germans are also sending frigates. This is an operation across the region. HMS Dragon is part of that operation, but it is not the only capability that the UK and our allies have.
What sort of look is it, Deputy Prime Minister? The French vessel, the Cristobal Colomb, is going to get there next week. 2 days later, the French Charles de Gaulle will get there. We've still got the welders on board HMS Dragon.
Look, I think that is an unfair assessment.
Everything I've said is accurate.
Of our military capability, recognising that the Middle East at this time is febrile, and of course, as I've said, we've got 400 additional personnel dealing with air defences across the region. But let me just say, you will recognise that UK armed forces are not just deployed in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. There are other theatres of conflict where they are deployed across the world.
When Sir Keir Starmer is criticised for his, and I quote, indecision, prevarication and lack of preparedness, how do you respond as his deputy?
Well, I know, working with Keir Starmer, that he keeps a cool, calm head, that he has the full support of British capability, and that's not just our armed forces, it's also our intelligence capability, that he's keen to work with our European allies particularly, and the E3 was very important in the initial hours of this conflict. And of course, there'll be comment around the sides. There will always be comment in anything, but often people are commenting without the full information is the truth.
The substance of international... Do you think is a breach of international law, what the US and Israel did, Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, that will be a matter for the US and Israel to answer. And of course, there will be a debate amongst international legal lawyers. That is not for me today. We were very clear that we would not be involved in the offensive action, but we are involved in the defensive action, which has a legal basis.
Well, can we see that legal basis?
And I am content with that. Well,
can you publish that legal basis, just to allay the concerns of my listeners?
There was a summary made available at the point at which the Prime Minister stood up earlier in the week and made clear the legal basis on which we would be engaged in defensive action, but he was concerned about plan, understandably. But now, where there are British civilians, British armed forces across the region, of course we will do everything we can to keep them safe.
But surely this action is part of an ongoing conflict that's been raging since 1979 and therefore does not need further UN authorisation. It's also a preemptive self-defence permissible under Article 51 of the UN Charter, I read. That's the true legal advice, isn't it?
Well, that will come down largely to whether there was an imminent threat. What I can say is that as Foreign Secretary, I sat down with the Iranians on many occasions. I challenged them on uranium enrichment in their country. I'm afraid the answers that I received were not satisfactory to me or my French and German colleagues that I was sitting down with at the time. It was not satisfactory to the US, and I updated Marco Rubio about this following a meeting last year. That is the basis on which the Americans and the Israelis have sought to act. It is for them to defend and to explain their legal basis, not for me.
Is it correct, reports suggest, that it was your colleague Ed Miliband who led the resistance to allowing US deployment of our bases?
It would not be right for me to comment on NSC meetings, but I would say that the Cabinet is completely united, as you would expect.
That's not what reports say, Mr. Lammy. They say Ed Miliband led a sort of splinter group. Do you recognise that?
Where we are putting our armed forces, where our armed forces are concerned, the Cabinet is completely united in this defensive action, the legal basis to act, and in the calm, steady approach that's required at this time.
Can you see a time in which offensive strikes would be authorised by the British government?
Well, the truth is that at this time, there are ballistic missiles being directed at us, and we are able to defend ourselves legally. It is for those on the ground operationally to make the assessment of how, when, what and why. But of course the UK government and I as Deputy Prime Minister fully support them in that action. And it's important that our soldiers know that they are absolutely underpinned by a legal basis to act.
how far does our support of President Trump go?
Well, of course, we work very closely with our...
Well, the relationship is rather shattered at the moment.
Oh,
Deputy Prime Minister.
Look.
I know you enjoyed a good personal relationship when you were last in Washington with him. I remember you telling me about this on LBC, but he talks about how he's disappointed, how it's not the Churchillian spirit of days of old. That's the reality as President Trump sees it, Deputy Prime Minister.
I actually read a New York Times interview where he also added that the Prime Minister's a good man and he works with him very well. Look, the rhetoric is intense. We have a special relationship because of our military intelligence capability, because of the trillion pounds, dollars we have invested in each other's economies. We have the closest of relationships. But from time to time, of course, whether it's Roosevelt and Churchill over the approach to Stalin, whether it's Wilson and LBJ over Vietnam, good friends can also have differences of approach, and it's right that we only put our soldiers into a war context where it is defensive and where there's a legal basis to act.
One last final question, if we can, taking you away from conflict, Deputy Prime Minister. It is reported that there is a growing backlash from some of your colleagues from Labour MPs over your senior colleague Shabana Mahmood's crackdown on asylum and the plan perhaps to pay people £40,000, up to £40,000 if they leave within 7 days. Does that plan, does Shabana Mahmood have your full unstinting support, Mr Lammy?
Well, look, I think a lot of your listeners will be concerned that if you're housing asylum seekers, it's £158,000 a year to house them in an asylum hotel.
But that's £430 a day, Deputy Prime Minister. That's like, would you put them in the Ritz?
It's £158,000 to house them in an asylum hotel.
£430 a day.
I imagine it's because sometimes we're talking about quite large families. On that basis, this is a pilot. It's a pilot copying what has been happening in Denmark. They have huge success in Denmark in sending people back. 95% hit rate they have in Denmark. Okay. I think the pilot is a good idea.
Has your full support, Deputy Prime Minister?
Absolutely.
Grateful for your time today. Thank you. Full update there on events there.